James Cleverly has defended his decision to visit China and their outspoken foreign minister Wang Yi. Um, I think this is a very big mistake of the Sunak government, and I'm disappointed by it because, um, I feel Sunak's probably one of the better Tory prime ministers of recent years. That's not saying much, but um, this is just a really big mistake, and I'm angry about it. As someone who cares about this country, and as someone who I'd call myself a China watcher on some level, not a China expert, but a China watcher, I think it's just nonsensical to look at what is blatantly happening and just sort of act like it's business as normal. Now, a while back, I think I made a video about this. Our Foreign Secretary James Cleverly made a speech at Mansion House, in which he said China isn't a normal partner and it presents a unique situation. Um, but during his election campaign to be Tory leader, Sunak said that China was a threat, but that's now changed to an epoch-defining challenge. So many would interpret that as watering it down so as not to offend Beijing. Um, Before I get further into the ins and outs of this, I will say this. Liz Truss has been widely ridiculed as our shortest serving Prime Minister, and there's no question she got a lot of things wrong. I think her economic policy was very, very misguided, hers and Kwasi Kwarteng's. I think it pandered to big, the perception was it pandered to the rich. Whether it did or didn't, I think it did. Her refusal to sort of um, go for higher corporation tax, and well, we all know about that notorious budget. That's that. There's a reason why she fell from power. Um, but one thing that can be said for Liz Truss, credit where credit's due, she has been consistently tough when it comes to China. Consistently. Um, she recently visited Taiwan. Some said she was trying to rekindle her political career. The Chinese scoffed at it. They pointed out she was Britain's short-serving prime minister. But I think Sunak hasn't been entirely honest in his China credentials. During the campaign, this is something Truss pointed out, that Sunak is weak on China. He said he wasn't, but now he's showing he is. Um, and I think it's really unfortunate. Channel 4 has just been interviewing Ian Duncan Smith, who is one of 7 MPs who is sanctioned by China, who's being tailed by their so-called wolf warrior diplomats. They don't deserve to be called diplomats; they're thugs. Now, Ian Duncan Smith isn't my favourite person in the world. I was very critical of his welfare policies, but he's right to say that this policy is very wrong. And there's others, Alicia Kearns of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I think it's called the China Research Group. Um, there's others. I think that this idea that we can have business as normal, it's obviously based on the fact that China is the world's second biggest economy. Maybe some notion that we can somehow, if we get the Chinese on side, they can pressure the Russians regarding Ukraine. But the war's been going on for over a year, and China hasn't done a damn thing to stop Russian aggression. Nothing. The most they've done is sat on the fence and, not outwardly armed Russia. That's about it, which is, it's good that they haven't armed Russia, but they haven't condemned Russia. And I think that's, quite telling. It maybe ties into my video I made about the BRICS the other day. But, even leaving the Russian situation aside, British-Chinese relations are really strained at the moment, and with good reason. China wasn't transparent over COVID, and the whole world paid the price. They're still not transparent. Their hawkish response when Australia called for an independent inquiry to, try and hammer the Australian wine industry. This was despite the fact the Australian Navy done its best to try and help find MH370, of which there were many Chinese victims. Um, We need to see the Chinese regime for what it is. It's a thuggish regime. And they conduct foreign policy through threats and intimidation. I remember last year the incident at the Manchester consulate where you had Hong Kong protesters and other critics of Beijing, in some cases literally dragged into the embassy compound, the consulate compound, no doubt to try and imply that they were under attack. But you had a situation where dissidents in the UK were being physically attacked by Chinese consular staff. That's a complete disgrace. I think we should have expelled the Chinese ambassador after that incident. And there is evidence that they've, been operating black jails in this country. Um, Certainly, the Confucius Institutes can't be trusted. Um, Sunak promised that those would be closed down. But this is a classic, Sunak's doing what the Johnson administration done, sort of flip-flopping on this issue. So one day he talks tough, the next day it's kind of, oh, we need to do business with the Chinese. Boris Johnson done the same thing. One day he's condemning Chinese human rights abuses, rightly so, but the next day it's, oh, I'm a Sinophile. Now, Sunak hasn't went that far, but I just think we shouldn't be flip-flopping in our message as a nation. I think Cleverly's wrong to visit China, just 5 years after the last visit. I think we need to be giving them the cold shoulder, sending out a message. It's not business as normal. Not so long as 7 elected British MPs are being harassed by CCP thugs. And I just hope that Tory backbenchers give Sunak and Cleverly hell over this. I hope that they really, really pressure them and say this is a mistake. I think one of the biggest foreign policy mistakes this country made in recent years was in the Cameron Osborne era, the so-called golden relations. It was just so naive because, of course, the Chinese spoke warmly of it at the time, but they were taking us for a ride. It was entirely one-sided. I think what needs to be done, well, the visits happen now. I think it was a very big mistake. I think it was wrong, and I don't think Cleverly should repeat that mistake. If there's some sort of big cyber attack or there's further intimidation of either Chinese dissidents in the UK, British parliamentarians who speak out, others, if that continues, and it almost certainly will, then Cleverly needs to explain how does he justify this? How does he say on one hand, because I read that Mansion House speech. Now, it wasn't outright appeasement. He was saying that China needs to be pressed on human rights. He did mention those things. But he also spent a very big part of that speech, the draft of it. I mean, I saw the draft, I didn't see the speech directly, but a very big bit of it was basically flattering the Chinese on their ancient civilization. And the fact that in the last 2 millennia, they've spent a big part of that being the global hegemony they were 1,000 years ago. And they may well be on course to be again. One thing about Chinese power is the Chinese economy right now is in a bad way. So it's the world's second biggest economy, but that may be tested right now. It may be more fragile than it seems. China's got record youth unemployment. It's got an aging population. So, for a long time, there's just been this idea that this big monolith that cannot be stopped. I think that's misguided, and that's the good news. It's good that China is not, on sort of on pushable on, for want of a better term. It's good that it's not unstoppable, because if we get to a situation, for example, where China starts to control the internet, we could be in a very, very grave situation regarding free expression. I'm not sure it will go that far, and I don't think that will happen. But I do think we've given too much ground to the Chinese. I think that our universities pander to China too much, because they're determined to shore up Chinese investment. But I think where you have, for example, academic research that crosses over into military departments in China, that needs to be really questioned. And our universities can say they're complying with the law, but I think they need to do more than just comply with the law. They need to show that they're not pandering to Chinese sensitivities. I'm not proposing that we just cut off all relations and don't talk to China at all. Clearly, China is more important in the world than Russia right now. We can afford to be really cold with Russia in a way that we can't necessarily with China. But that doesn't mean that we need to go out of our way to please them. And it sure as hell shouldn't translate as, a state visit or even a diplomatic visit. Not at this time. Not just, over a year after the pandemic was declared over, not when, they misled the world on that. Not when the endemic abuses are going on in Xinjiang. Not when the wolf warrior so-called diplomats are threatening people in this country. It's a damn disgrace. And I think it reflects badly on the government. It reflects badly on Sunak and Cleverly as a Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, respectively. And I think for everything she got wrong, I think Liz Truss was right about this. So credit where credit is due. But I hope Starmer really, really pushes this issue. I don't know who's Cleverly's opposite number at the moment, but I hope he or she pushes the issue. I hope Tory backbenchers push the issue. And I hope that Sunak rolls back on this and doesn't, he needs to match his tough words. Because when he was campaigning to be leader, it was about China being a threat. Now he's watering this down and frankly he's showing weakness. And Rishi Sunak's not an idiot. I think he's a clever man. So this is just unnecessary. My fear is that we're going to end up basically where we were in 2015, which was the last state visit of Xi Jinping. Um, I don't think Sunak would be so foolish as to invite Xi Jinping to a full state visit, but there is a cybersecurity summit coming up at Bletchley Park. Now, apparently, China's being, stopped from going to the most sensitive areas of that summit. It's not cybersecurity, excuse me, an AI summit. Again, there's going to be real concerns over that because it's all very well saying, oh, we'll stop them seeing the most sensitive data or whatever, but China's shown it's very, very adept at espionage. We can't trust them. We cannot trust them. There have been numerous examples of incidents. For example, Christine Lee, a lawyer in Birmingham, you know, um, she was a normal member of the community, just like these Bulgarian agents working for Russia. She was a solicitor, totally on the right side of the law, but it turned out she was a Chinese spy. Interestingly enough, there was no follow up to that. There was absolutely nothing on that she'd been kicked out of the country or she'd been arrested or what. I wonder why. I actually pushed, he had a live sort of session at the time on Facebook, Dominic Raab, when he was Foreign Secretary, and I actually asked him about this. And they did reply. He said, well, I'm sure you'll understand for security reasons I can't go into details, but rest assured we take the China threat seriously, and we will not stand for this. But, I understand he maybe can't go into all the details, but, this just seems strange that there's no follow up at all. If the situation was in reverse and a British national was arrested in China for espionage, you could be damn sure they would have a show trial and they would parade that individual on state television. I'm sick and tired of this situation where we get insulted, where we get our sovereignty compromised, and our response just seems watered down. It's like we're terrified of offending Beijing. So we need to take this approach whereby we understand they're powerful, we understand they're a major economy, but we need to stop being so damn timid. For example, when these so-called wolf warriors insult us, as they regularly do, I think we need to throw insults straight back. I'm not saying go to the gutter, but I'm saying we need to match fire with fire. We need to stop treating this as a normal situation because it isn't. And this naive idea that, this has been tried for years by Western countries, not just the UK. Well, if we kind of be cautious of China, if we're not too vocal about human rights, if we're cautious, then they'll reform naturally and they'll modernize in terms of the human rights situation, in terms of relations with the West. But the opposite has happened. China is more authoritarian now than it was 10 years ago, 11 years ago when Xi Jinping came to power. It's more hostile to the West and it's more arrogant in terms of its attitude towards the West. In the past, the situation would be human rights questions would come up and China would use the usual line, this is our internal affairs, the West should respect that. That was always the go-to. But now they couple that with sort of arrogant nationalism We've seen what's happening in the South China Sea, the threats towards neighbouring countries like Vietnam and the Philippines. The Chinese Navy regularly threatens those surrounding countries. They seem to think that, ancient maps dictate that they can have their maritime territory right up to the Philippines coast. Um, that's a sensitive issue in that part of the world. That's why Barbie was censored, actually, on this occasion by Vietnam and I believe the Philippines over I think it's called the 13 dash line. But anyway, I'll round this up. But I'm frustrated by this. I think that Ian Duncan Smith and others are right to speak up. I think that it's a very big mistake by Sunak and Cleverly to send the Chinese a message that they can push us around and there'll be no consequences, that we'll just treat them like a normal diplomatic partner. I think what needs to happen is, when they insult us, when they threaten us, we need to be summoning the ambassador to London, to the Foreign Office. And I think if it continues, we frankly need to threaten him with expulsion. Of course, there'll be reprisal in China. That's what we need to expect. But we cannot send out the message that we could be pushed around as a nation state. That to me is, frankly, makes me want to throw up. This idea that we could be pushed around. It's disgraceful appeasement. Um, and Sunak needs to understand this will go down very badly. If Starmer had any sense, he would use this. He would be hammering this point in terms of foreign policy. Sunak's got it right regarding Russia. So did Boris Johnson, so did Liz Truss. But Johnson and Sunak have shown themselves to be flip-flopping on China. It's not good enough. Um, I'm sure there's other things to say about this subject, but in Channel 4 they described Tory backbenchers as incandescent with rage. Well, I'm not surprised, because they're seeing their colleagues personally and their families and their staff personally harassed by Beijing. This isn't just some vague thing from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. This is actual empirical harassment. That is an absolute disgrace. I think we need to be summoning the Chinese ambassador over that. Back off now. Of course, he'll deny it, but the evidence is there. Back off now. And frankly, this also applies to Chinese nationals. Any Chinese national in the UK who's parroting the CCP, who's pushing aggressive nationalism, frankly, I don't think they belong in this country. I don't think they deserve to have a visa in this country. Because as someone who's been in China, you can be damn sure if I had been really vocal against the CCP over there, I would have been arrested as a spy. I was careful. I respected my hosts, I respected the country, and I avoided politics, because it was just too damn risky to do that. Okay, that's my take on this. Sunak and Cleverly need to, seriously reverse this policy, or I don't know. They need to wake up, and Sunak needs to stick to his pledge of being tough with China, because this is the exact opposite. It's appeasement. It's cowardly and it's pathetic.